ladies and gentlemen, I think we should get started. Good evening all. Thank you for coming out in this cold winter's evening. I'm Peter Jennings, for those of you who don't know me, the Executive Director of ASPI, and welcome to the launch of Agenda for Change 2016. This is an attempt to offer advice on a wide range of defence and national security issues to whichever party forms government after the July 2nd election. And it follows a similar publication which we produced, I guess, at about this time of the election cycle in 2013. But this one is a little different. There are many policy proposals in the book. And as you would expect in a collaboration which actually involves 27 authors, there's a wide range of views which aren't necessarily consistent. So it has both the plot depth and the cast of characters of your average Game of Thrones series, and even more expensive to produce, as a matter of fact, or at least if government implemented the recommendations. Now, I should say that the views reflect the thinking of the authors only. ASPI does not take corporate views on any issues. And we aim to not be politically partisan either, but we are passionate about policy. And I think that's what shines through the book, is a real passion for ideas and new policy thinking. And what a shame there seems to be such a deficit of that in the Canberra environment right now. Of course, with new policy thinking comes risk, and risk seems to be the prime reason for ignoring or minimising policy creativity on the part of many officials and politicians. So we hope to provide a corrective and a tonic for those of you who might be feeling a little jaded about the policy process. Now, just to tell you about how the format of the evening will work, Laura Tingle will launch the book. Thank you so much, Laura, for coming. We're then going to have a panel of some of the authors who will speak briefly to the contents of it, some Q&A from you, and I hope everyone here will be prepared to actively take part. And then the thing you'll all be waiting for, ASPI's famous drinks and snacks, which will conclude the evening. So let me introduce Laura Tingle, probably who doesn't need too many words of introduction to a policy-savvy audience like this. Laura is the political editor of the Australian Financial Review, based in the Press Gallery at Parliament House here in Canberra. She writes on news specialising in politics, policy and the economy. Laura has over 30 years' experience as a journalist working covering markets, economics and politics. That means you must have started at 9, I guess, Laura, in terms of your journalistic career. She's won 2 Walkley Awards and the Paul Lynham Award for Excellence in Press Gallery Journalism. She's also been highly commended by the Walkley Judges for Investigative Reporting. She's the author of a book titled Chasing the Future, Recession, Recovery and the New Politics in Australia, which was about the political and economic fallout of the recession in the early 2000s. And most recently, and the reason why I asked Laura to come and speak here this evening, is she's the author of a quarterly essay study which was produced towards the end of 2015 called Political Amnesia, How We've Forgot to Govern. And in that she asks questions like, whatever happened to good government? What are the signs of bad government? And indeed, can Malcolm Turnbull apply the lessons of the past in this very different world? Now, Laura looks for answers in her book. She shows the long-term harm that comes from undermining the public sector as a repository of ideas and experience, and she tracks the damage done when responsibility is contracted out, for example, to a think tank, Laura, for the development of policy areas, and when politicians shut out or abuse their traditional sources of advice. So she's very well qualified, I think, to speak at the launch of a book which is all about policy ideas. Can I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Laura Tingle.
Thanks, Peter, and good evening, everyone. About 40 years ago, when I was definitely 9, I was cast in the school play as Peach's The Barrel Girl. And I can't remember what the plot of the play was, but my school friends and somewhat alarmingly my teachers seemed to think I was perfect for the part of the blonde who did this and this to draw attention to the prizes. And I feel a bit like I'm reprising that role tonight. Hugely flattered as I am to have been asked to offer a few comments at the launch of ASPI's very excellent strategy document. I'm feeling a bit like a bit of a fraud, since my journalistic relationship with defence and national security issues is best described as a series of accidental stumbles into the field when the Financial Review doesn't have anybody else available to write about it. Depressingly, the regularity with which this non-specialist writer is covering such complex areas is an increasingly common phenomenon in the media as our old economic model collapses. But what is happening in the media only emphasises the importance of organisations like ASPI and publications like Agenda for Change in 2016. And as Peter says, reflects a lot of what I was talking about in last year's quarterly essay. The scrutiny of and debate about so much public policy is becoming abysmal, and nowhere is this more obvious than in the world of defence and national security. It is, after all, a world where technical expertise, appeals to national interest in maintaining secrecy, and ideology can too often all come together in a perfect storm of, well, bullshit. Whatever the official briefs to the incoming government are going to say, ASPI has provided us average punters with a bit of a glimpse into the issues that may be affecting our strategic situation over the next 3 years. And I like the fact that the span of the report covers everything from cyberspace to the link between economic risks and strategic risks, to a forceful argument about why the defence establishment's contemptible attitude to the media, whatever its previously acknowledged shortcomings, is now actually harmful to its own interests in the digital age. There is a lot to dig into in this report, from regional economic diplomacy to Antarctic policy, and the need to reconsider the infrastructure of our alliance with the United States. If there's an underlying theme in the report which resonates with me, it is that of old paradigms tottering at the end of their natural lives. Whether it is the idea that, well, maybe we really should be considering nuclear submarines, or that we need to articulate the government's strategic intent in law enforcement policy, or ponder the bigger implications for our relationship with Europe from going with the French subs. Much of what occupies politics, and thus a political journalist, is the constant search for, or even resistance to, the overturning of paradigms. Sometimes this process occurs without us noticing it or remarking on it. Consider the transformation in what we might loosely call industry policy in the last 3 years. Remember Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey and their machismo war on corporate welfare? The context was a newly elected government trying to show its tough fiscal credentials and its preparedness to share the pain around by telling industries on their knees that they were on their own. Now, I'm certainly not an advocate of industries that are on their way out being artificially propped up. But compare not just that rhetoric, but that policy position with where we stand today, with a massive defence industry spend now proudly promoted as the centrepiece of the government's industry and innovation platform. Old paradigm shifts under the weight of politics and political language. Once again, this can often be what we are not talking about as much as what we are talking about. Consider how the political conversation about national security has been toned down since the change of prime ministers. Both sides of politics maintain a very tough line on national security and border security, of course, but the growing presence of military images in politics and the unresisted temptation to constantly scare people has subsided. Such a de-escalation actually gives both sides of politics a lot more room to regroup and manoeuvre. Mark Thompson notes in his contribution to this paper that Mark Thompson notes the tension between economic and strategic risks in his contribution to ASPI's paper. He notes the need to reduce economic risk by retiring debt on the one hand and reducing strategic risk by spending more on defence. But even in the field of economic strategy, the old paradigms are under much more challenge in the political realm than we might realise. Neither side of politics feels safe simply promising a return to budget surplus. They've both been burnt on that one. Nor do they believe they will get kudos from looking macho on spending cuts. Even tax reform has lost its lustre. Labor's willingness to embrace the previously sacrilegious idea that we will have to raise taxes marks the gradual change in the playing field of the budget debate. This transformation has all been happening under a sort of cloak in which many of the participants, and certainly a lot of newspaper editors, some of whom I know quite well, still frame everything in the old paradigm rather than acknowledging things are actually changing and that they may actually be losing the argument. But Labor has been emboldened by the fact it has actually got some kudos for policy bravery. This could see further transformation of the debate in the next 3 years. What remains to be seen is how third-party interventions affect this debate after the election, whether that be in the form of ratings agencies or developments in the international economy. The implications of this for the strategic debate, of course, are immense, both in the sense of what topics dominate our political discourse and in terms of how it shapes the defence spend. No doubt ASPI will be watching it and briefing us all on all of these developments. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Laura, and I'm reminded in one of your recent forays into defence commentary how you described Dennis Richardson and myself sparring with each other over the Port of Darwin issue by saying it was like watching two old bulls in a paddock headbutt each other. And as I read it, I thought to myself, two old bulls? So what we'll do now is we'll move to the discussion and Q&A part of the event. So I'll invite my two colleagues and Laura to also come up and take a chair. We're going to hear from Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst in Defence Policy and Capability, and Jacinta Carroll, who's the head of our ASPI Counter-Terrorism Policy Unit, and myself, to talk about the, in as quick a way as we can, the recommendations that are contained in the document. And then I'll hand to my colleague Anthony Bergen to run Q&A. So now I will depart to a different place from which to speak. And what I want to do is just very quickly talk about my own contribution in the book, which is really to talk about the what I think are some of the broadest levels of policy challenge facing government. And I made essentially 4 recommendations for what it is that government should do, 2 of which have been reasonably thoroughly covered in the media over the last 24 hours, including by Laura, thank you, and 2 which have not had much mention at all, but I think are also worth mentioning. So the first one is a recommendation to say that I think it's now time for the government to step up efforts to quickly try to defeat the Islamic State in Iraq. And that is based on a judgment about the success, relative success of the military campaign over the last 6 months or so, which through a process of increasingly well-targeted airstrikes has been able to predate a large number of Islamic State fighters and to start to make genuine inroads against their leadership. As Iraq now starts to move its own forces, along with a significant number of Shia militia into the town of Fallujah, I think this is the moment when the West has really got to decide if it has a strategy of stalemate or a real intent to want to try to defeat the Islamic State, at least as far as Iraq is concerned. And so my recommendation is that government should be, to use a phrase, agile in terms of looking at changes in America's approach. America is now quietly putting more special forces and other troops into the country, and be prepared to do the same, possibly after the US election, if that may be a useful contribution towards destroying the leadership of this odious organisation. My second recommendation, which didn't get much pickup in the press, was to talk about how we should modernise the management of our relationship with the United States. And I'll just say in brief, that's significant because if you look at the Defence White Paper and if if you look at all of the things the white paper says should be happening in the alliance relationship, we are going to get a very different ANZUS from the ANZUS that we have right now. It's going to be much more intense, much more interoperable between the military forces of the two countries, working pretty much in a seamless way on military operations. And I don't think the mechanisms that we've got in place with ANZUS right now will actually make that happen. ANZUS is almost a perfect example of a strategy donut. It's got lots of activities taking place around the edges, and it has a hollow centre where an organisational structure should be. My argument is that a once-a-year meeting of Australian and US defence and foreign ministers is not enough to now steer what is becoming a significantly more intense relationship. My fourth recommendation, I'll come back to the third in a second because that's the one that's had coverage. My fourth recommendation was around industry policy and really saying that in order to give some practicality to the government's idea of a continuous build of ships and submarines in Australia, we're going to have to look at an export base much more effectively than we have in the past, because we simply can't provide that market for all of the equipment that defence industry is capable of making. And so I have a series of recommendations which really go to, could government get as serious about that as the British say, or the French, in terms of thinking about how to market Australian defence equipment, particularly into the Asian region. I won't labour that particular point any further because I did want to spend the last 2 minutes on my next recommendation, which was it's time now to prepare the ground for Australia to be able to move to nuclear propulsion for submarines, probably a decade or 15 years from now. When I was involved with the external advisory panel to the government on the Defence White Paper, one of the things we did was conduct a public consultation around the country, and I can tell you that the single most prominent question by none that the team received was, why isn't Australia thinking about nuclear propulsion for submarines? What does it mean? There was a mix of views. There was a small element of people who were opposed, come what may, you might say, to that idea, but a much larger group of people who simply wanted to find more information about how this could be done. And indeed, one of our recommendations to the government was find a way to talk to the Australian public about nuclear propulsion for submarines. Unfortunately, that hasn't really happened. It didn't happen in the 2016 Defence White Paper. It didn't happen when Mr Turnbull launched that the design announcement of the submarine in Adelaide a few weeks ago. And so we still have this sort of thirst for information. Why nuclear power? Why can't Australia do this? Why can't we just buy a nuclear boat now? I think there are very clear reasons why it is beyond our capability at this very moment to say instantly we will move to nuclear propulsion. We need to go through a process of intense training within the Navy to build a group of submariners with those capabilities. We need to develop a safety framework in place to manage how those submarines will operate. We need to build a relationship with a parent Navy that's either the British, the Americans or the French, who will be the Navy that assists us to move to this. And I think it'll take probably 5 or 10 years for us to get to that point, to have the capability to do it. So my recommendations go to saying to the government, let's start the conversation. That is something that is within the government's power to do after the 2nd of July. And let's see if we can put a future Australian government, probably sometime in the mid-2020s, into a position where it can make that choice, if indeed that's a choice a future Australian government wants to make. So all of that is covered in the book in a series of succinct recommendations, and I hope you'll be able to spend some time reading and thinking about those particular approaches. What I'll do now is hand over to my colleagues. Malcolm, are you going to go first to talk about the defence lines?
Ladies first, I think.
Jacinta, let's go first to talk about national security.
We'll go to the most important issue first then, shall we? I'll focus my comments on counter-terrorism and the counter-terrorism chapter, but I will commend to you the range of other national security issues that are covered by my colleagues. And if your questions go to that when we get to Q&A as well, please ask them, because we may have a go at asking them, but we do have expert authors in our audience as well. Look, There are a range of issues that we cover on counter-terrorism in the paper, but I'll limit my comments to 2 key observations about the environment and 3 of the key policy recommendations. So the first issue is that we will have terrorist attacks. One thing that I'd like to see more of in, again, the discussion that we have with the Australian people is that terrorism is a crime. It is a crime that will occur. We've got a lot of great activity that's occurred in our country to minimise the impact, but part of succeeding against terrorism and part of effectively countering terrorism is to move away from a zero tolerance approach. So understand there will be terrorist attacks. The second point is that this is a very complex environment. Countering terrorism, the terrorist threat and countering terrorism covers all jurisdictions across Australia. It covers the domestic environment and the international environment. It crosses into the private sector, and indeed our first responders won't necessarily be people who have anything day-to-day to do with counter-terrorism, and those affected are the Australian public. Not small segments of the Australian public, but it could be anywhere. So the 3 key policy recommendations I'll speak to are the need for a true strategic plan for countering terrorism. Secondly, the need to regularise our preparation and our evaluation in these areas. Critically, exercising decision-making across jurisdictions and formalising lessons learned from incidents. The third policy recommendation goes to our international strategy, and Peter's spoken effectively on the Islamic State issue, and I would add to that also an immediate focus needed for our region in the Asia-Pacific. The day-to-day focus of our next government will be largely unrelated to terrorism and counter-terrorism. Most government attention necessarily, and thankfully, is focused on immediate issues of social policy, the economy, employment, defence and industry. The thing with terrorism is that when a terrorist attack occurs, the government's focus is on nothing but the terrorist attack. So we need to take the time, noting that there's a shortened turnaround frame for attacks, and we have good disruptions, but there will be attacks. We need to do everything we can to ensure that the government maintains an eye on this issue and is best placed to respond to an issue when it occurs. I'm saying that terrorist attacks will occur. The aim, of course, of the most significant terrorist groups at the moment is for a mass casualty attack. We've had 3 terrorist attacks in Australia since September 2014, when the terror alert level was raised to probable. More importantly, though, we've had 9 disrupted attacks. So 9 plots aiming for mass casualty attacks have been effectively disrupted. That's a great indicator of the counter-terrorism capability out there, but it's also an indicator that this will continue, and that high number just shows the intensity of these activities. Since 9/11, 75% of the investigations that have occurred and 75% of the disruptions and arrests have occurred in that almost 2-year period. So 75% of what's been going on has happened just in that short amount of time. 400 investigations are ongoing right now, and that's really stretching the resources of our law enforcement and our security services. There's been plenty of government resources put into counter-terrorism, and there are a lot of counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism programs in place across the Commonwealth, the state and territory governments, and a really effective role being played by our private sector partners. But this is a very complex environment with a range of players. We don't have in this country a shared strategy, a framework or a plan that links and directs all of these various activities towards collective goals. This is no mean feat, I might say, noting the amount of players and the broad range of issues. But we could do a bit better. We currently don't have a common platform of easily accessible information communicating Australia's counter-terrorism efforts to the Australian people, nor do we have one that communicates our efforts to the international community. So we need a strategic plan for counter-terrorism. And this would have 3 parts essentially. One is explaining the terrorist threat in clear terms, again to those who are involved in countering terrorism, but very importantly to the Australian people who've put a lot of trust in governments to deal with this issue. Secondly, this plan would explain what the government is doing and what it plans to do. And thirdly, within that, provide a structure to guide future activity. We do have a document from last year, the 2015 Counter-Terrorism Strategy, produced by the Council of Australian Governments, and it's a really good foundation for this work, but it doesn't provide that future focus. It does provide a common understanding of what the issue is, and also a very good explanation of what was going on at that time. But we need that shared vision for the future and a plan, so that people aren't surprised when another tranche of counter-terrorism legislation comes out and aren't confused about, for example, what that might mean. This would also be, in terms of accountability and communication, this plan would be the basis for a counter-terrorism annual report of some form. This is what we're going to do, and this is how we've done it. The second area, regularising preparation and review. I talk about two key areas in the report, and one is the importance of exercising. I'd recommend that we have regular counter-terrorism training exercises for decision makers. There are some forms of exercise that happen, but I would say that they're more characterised as situational awareness and just checking what do I have. What has served well in some other areas within the Australian context, but also in some international jurisdictions, is actually having real-time scenarios and real-time ambiguous decision-making by stakeholders, Prime Minister, Premiers, commanders, industry members who are involved, actually pushing them into the situation of understanding what their authorities are and what type of decisions they may need to do. Making them make decisions in an ambiguous environment also provides that opportunity for mistakes to be made. Some of the things that I'm aware of from some of the events that have occurred show that there wasn't that level of understanding about roles, and there is of course a complexity because of the jurisdictional environment. The Commonwealth won't always be the lead, and very rarely will it actually be the lead. It will likely be state and territory jurisdictions. And I note Laura's comments on that, just that lack of experience and memory in this space, which is quite noticeable. So it would be helpful to have a formalised process for exercising. I'd also say for the exercise program to have formal ongoing programs and procedures to review how those exercises have gone, actually capture those lessons learnt and apply them, and use a similar mechanism for reviewing terrorist events. So that can be a terrorist attack, but it can also be a significant disruption. So as we look at some of the more developed plans that are coming forward, well, what worked well in discovering that, what could have been improved, and what does that indicate for the future? So for events, I would recommend a formal mechanism for review that just has three parts. One is a quick look. So within 4 weeks of an event, such as the Lint Cafe, formalise a review of what went on and apply some lessons learned. Informally, some things like this have happened through in response to some terrorist activities. That's a really good basis for informing our future activity, and I would recommend that we formalise those arrangements and share that across the jurisdictions. Secondly, after an event or a significant disruption, within that sort of 6 to 8 month period, undertake a comprehensive review of everything that has happened and look to have lessons learnt and applied. And thirdly, importantly, not just having that, let's hope they'll be applied, but that third element is an implementation plan for lessons learned so that we don't need to learn those lessons again. Currently, curiously, the only formal mechanism that undertakes a full review of terrorist incidents are coronial inquiries. We're all watching as the Lint Cafe inquiry is going through, and there's so much focus and hope for what will come out of that, but at the end of the day, that's a New South Wales coronial inquiry looking at 2 deaths. It's attempting to do more because there's a need and there's a desire for more. Well, let's not rest all of that on one jurisdiction's coroners, and they operate differently from all of the others. Let's actually provide a mechanism for a timely review, not something that starts more than a year after the event. The Newman Hyder incident, again, delayed. Another area for preparation that government has been grappling with is, at the Commonwealth level, is countering violent extremism. And I would argue that the Commonwealth can add the greatest value by facilitating and supporting local actions, primarily state-driven actions, and providing an opportunity to share experiences and program knowledge. Practical things would be establishing research and practitioner networks and providing a database of educational material. We've got some work, great work that's happening with the new CVE hub that brings together some information on activities that occur in some resources available internationally. I think we can augment that with some other helpful pieces. In the international environment, again, beyond Australia, there is significant terrorist threat in our region, and there's a scope and opportunity and a desire for us to work more closely with our partners, particularly in Southeast Asia, but more broadly in the Asia Pacific, to look at joint initiatives to counter terrorism and to counter violent extremism. I would suggest that Australia can play a great role here, particularly in partnership with countries that have been close and sometimes occasionally come close, such as Indonesia, and we're doing some great work in the counter-terrorism financing field in this area. That's a kind of model. Let's look for how we can work together to deal with this shared threat. Similarly, I'd say that Australia could assist by helping to develop a regional countering violent extremism network and also a resource database. So back to those key couple of issues, just to recap. There will be terrorist plots and attacks during the time of the next government, and the government should be prepared. There's a great basis of work. Let's just keep working at that and building upon it. Secondly, this is a complex issue that cuts across all jurisdictions and across all issues. It cuts across social policy, education, health and employment. Let's understand that and use that in the slow term. So the key policy recommendations, again, I'd argue for a strategic plan for counter-terrorism, the need to regularise preparation and evaluation, and to have a long-term international strategy. So in conclusion, I think we're in a very good place with countering terrorism, and the bipartisan approach needs to be built upon and continued. The Commonwealth Government can take a lead in bringing all the stakeholders and issues together and providing a common strategy and guidelines. The government needs a long-term and comprehensive strategy and program which is supported by regularised activities. But the risk is, without this coordinated response, Australia may again be surprised when the next terrorist attack comes and suboptimal in our response.
Thank you, Senator. Thanks. Malcolm, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for giving me the chance to introduce Agenda for Change 2016. I want to focus tonight on the defence side of things. I was within the Defence Strategy and Capability team that wrote that chapter. And so let me go through some of our points that we came up with. I think when we look at the Defence White Paper that came out earlier this year, it's very clear that Australia has moved one step further away from a narrow focus on the traditional Defence of Australia paradigm. We're now moving towards a new forward-leaning defence strategy. And I think this is going to present a series of challenges and opportunities that we need to address in the next term of government. In particular, I think Australia needs to be more willing to share the burden in Asia alongside the US and our regional partners as we take on a bigger role. In particular, I think we need to be prepared to adopt a more globalist vision and shape our defence policy and defence strategy around that, rather than maintaining the traditional focus on concentric circles. I think also we shouldn't be afraid to embrace a new strategic mindset of a rising power that is strategically bold, but which also accepts greater strategic burden and risk. And what does that actually mean? Well, it means, and I think I echo Peter's comments here, that we need to strengthen the US-Australian alliance in practical ways that reinforces both the substance and the scope of the rebalance to Asia. And the rebalance is critical that succeeds. It needs to be real and meaningful and enduring. So we should aim to spend more and acquire greater capability that directly contributes to the success of the rebalance, and in particular that supports US security interests, rather than we risk being seen as a defence freeloader. We have to carry our share of the burden. And as Kim Beazley notes in his introduction, this may mean we move from interoperability with the Americans to integration with the Americans. Turning to capability and force structure development, I think we need to be ready to move quickly and effectively if our planning assumptions in the white paper are overtaken by events in the region. I think this demands consideration of new ADF capabilities beyond the force structure suggested in the 2016 white paper. We've obviously increased defence spending to match. And so when we looked at this, we felt that there were two key risks that we need to be prepared for. Firstly, the possibility of an acceleration in both the pace and the scope of Chinese military modernisation, and a greater willingness on the part of Beijing to undertake coercive activities in the South China Sea. And people are already talking about the potential for China to declare an air defence identification zone or militarise artificial islands such as Scarborough Shoal, as well as a growing Chinese ability to project substantial military presence into the Indian Ocean. Secondly, the risk is that in spite of our best efforts, the US rebalance may effectively be stillborn. And this could occur either through a strategic retrenchment under a prospective President Trump, or through domestic fiscal constraints in the US that sees reductions in the size and capability of US military forces in the Asia Pacific. So think about the possibility of a return of sequestration, for example, in 2018. And the third possibility is that the US faces new challenges in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and thus is distracted from the Asia Pacific region. So we need to be prepared for both of these key strategic risks when we think about capability and force structure development, and think in terms of how do we respond to the unexpected. In considering military capability risks, we decided that there are a number of potential risks, and these are highlighted in the reports, but I'll talk about two significant ones tonight. The first is the potential for a serious delay in the Joint Strike Fighter program, particularly in the system development and demonstration phase, as a result of software problems that could lead to an increasing risk of a fighter gap emerging in the early 2020s as the classic Hornets are retired. If the JSF is not ready to replace the classic Hornets, then we need to think about an alternative platform to address that fighter gap. And we came to the conclusion that additional Super Hornets are the obvious solution. But we need to start thinking about those sorts of contingencies in the next term of government. And also, we need to recognise that in terms of replacing the existing 24 Super Hornets that we have a real opportunity there to get on board with next generation air capabilities rather than potentially just investing automatically in another squadron of JSFs. So we need to look at options like uninhabited combat air systems and sixth generation fighters and examine what could, for example, the US third offset program do for us in that regard. I think more seriously than the prospect of a fighter gap, there's a clear strategic disconnect between our planning for the future submarine, the 12 DCNS short fin Barracudas, in terms of the timeline when we're going to get them. The first one doesn't arrive until the early 2030s, and the last one we won't get until the late 2040s. And it's going to take this long to get that capability, and at the same time, the strategic environment that we face would tend to suggest that we need to boost our naval capabilities much more rapidly. So there's a strategic disconnect there that the next government needs to think about. How do we address that? On the issue of submarines, I think I echo Peter's thoughts. There is a clear case for preparing the Royal Australian Navy to move from conventional to nuclear submarines in the future. We came to the conclusion that there should be a policy debate and planning for this possibility, and that policy debate and planning should begin now to ensure that options are available to government for a white paper mandated capability review on the short fin Barracuda that will occur in the late 2020s. And that's going to be a priority, I think, for the next government. Given these capability issues, it's very clear that the proposed target in terms of defence spending of 2% GDP should become not an aspirational ceiling, but a mandatory floor. And we should move up and work up from that mandatory floor of 2% GDP to see just how much capability we need given the strategic environment that we face, the resources that we have, and the demands of our strategy. And I think that's a critical step. I think it became clear when we were doing this chapter that capability planning without matching resources is merely wishful thinking. So it's critical to get the defence budget correct, and Mark Thompson did a lot of good work on this. We have a bipartisan funding commitment which is excellent, and I think that's a major step forward in Australian defence planning. but this commitment must be sustained if we are to minimise risk. And in this regard, there are some challenges on the horizon. In particular, there is an increasing pressure to reduce the federal debt that's going to peak at the next federal election. And that's compounded by limited and declining public support for the increasing the defence budget, should we need to do so. Therefore, government really does have to take a leadership role here and make it clear the strong case for increasing defence spending in order to acquire additional capabilities if the strategic outlook demands that we do so. Of course, defence spending is inevitably linked with defence reforms, and those are associated with the first principles review. That's linked into risks within the procurement process, including the possibility that neither defence nor industry can manage increasing funds effectively. And defence has already handed back close to $500 million this year in terms of defence spending because it can't afford to spend it. So we need to move swiftly on the first principles review recommendations when they and act upon them quickly to ensure a stable and smooth procurement process into the future. Turning to operational commitments, two of my colleagues, James Mogue and Chris Cohen, did excellent work on this. They looked at all the potential contingencies that we might face in the next term of government, and they found that this could include the possibility of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief tasks in the South Pacific and elsewhere, a likelihood of continued deployment into the Middle East in support of counter-terrorist operations there, greater likelihood of ADF involvement in maritime territorial disputes in East and Southeast Asia, including potentially freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, and the potential for the ADF involvement in high-intensity regional conflicts. In particular, we felt that disputes in maritime Southeast Asia, such as the South China Sea, and the potential for high-end conflict occurring on the Korean Peninsula, could see deployed ADF units at greater risk of direct attack from adversary forces. And that contingency could also see additional risks for US forces stationed in Australia to come under direct attack, thus seeing the potential for direct attack against Australia. So we need to be prepared for those high-end contingencies with greater risk. Finally, in terms of defence diplomacy, there were two key tasks that we felt were important: ensuring active and deepening defence engagement with the US and strengthening intra-Asian defence engagement. In regards to Australia-US relations, we were concerned about the prospect of a Trump presidency emerging in the future and what this would mean for the US commitment to Asia, and with it the potential future or survival of the rebalance. But we also noted that even with the possibility of a Clinton presidency, the political forces that have been unleashed by Trump, and it should be said Bernie Sanders, in the US polity, could constrain a Clinton administration's freedom of action potentially for the long term. And here it's important to remember that whoever wins this year in the US, the forces of the anti-establishment left and right will not go away, and if Clinton wins, they may intensify. So you could see in 2020 and 2024 a more intensive situation compared to what it is now in terms of these left and right-wing anti-establishment forces. So I think it's important that Australia proceed on the basis and the assumption that the US rebalancing will continue, and we should exploit opportunities to sustain that. But we have to work harder in that regard. We have to ensure that there's a much greater intersection of US and Australian strategic interests, and we have to work towards a stronger ANZUS in coming years. And I think certainly the US will expect us to step up to the plate. We have to recognise that now, unlike in the Cold War, we are a frontline state, and the US expectations for us will be accordingly greater. Let me finish up with some comments on Australia's relations with our Asian neighbours. It's very clear we need to build our defence profile across Asia, and particularly in a multilateral level, and with stronger defence relationships with Indonesia, Japan, India and China. When we were writing the chapter, we obviously recognised the importance of building closer Australian-Indonesian defence relations, and that had to be based on focusing on shared regional interests and opportunities. Japan also, we felt, is a vital partner, and we have some hard work to do to address Japanese defence relationships, the Japanese-Australian defence relations after the submarine outcome. So we have to work hard there, and I think if we can bring Japan-Australian defence relations back on an even keel, that will bring substantial defence benefits and capabilities to the table. We should continue to work towards closer defence cooperation with India. And finally, we do need to work with China and the PLA, but only when our shared interests allow it. Thank you very much.
So, folks, we'll now hand over to Anthony to moderate some Q&A. You've only just picked up the document, so I guess that's going to make it a little hard, but if there's any issues that you'd like us to expand on, we're very happy to do that.
And we've only got, Karen, right about 10-15 minutes, right? Is that correct?
Let's.
So, please, no long speeches, very short questions, and to identify yourself and to whom you're directing your question. Sir.
Yeah, Tony Forrester from Defence. Really for Peter and Jacinta, because you brought it up early. I've been coming to these ASPI things for some years now, as you know, and I've been involved quite some time. I've got to say, it doesn't matter which topic we're addressing, whether it's defence or security or resilience through Paul, a very similar theme is coming out of all of these discussions, and frankly, it's about, if I can be quite blunt about it, the Australian Public Service's capacity to actually provide contestable policy development, not just sustainment development, where it's truly it's innovative and it's engaged. I applaud ASPI because ASPI seems to be the only ginger group at the moment actually providing policy contestability. And I'm concerned that the APS has lost its capacity to bring forward coherent arguments based on our balance of interests and a true analysis of alternatives. I'd like the panel's view on whether, not just in the defence arena, in any arena, this country actually has the capacity to innovate in a policy sense, because I don't see it.
And Tony, can I add to that question to Laura, take advantage of Laura's presence? I mean, how does the defence and national security, foreign affairs debate compare to the economic, social policy? You know, you've been writing on economic affairs for over 20 years or something. How does what we discuss compare in terms of the quality, do you think, to I think quite a sophisticated discussion now of economic policy?
Do you want to go first on that, Laura? And I'll maybe go back to Tony's question.
I mean, I say all of this as somebody who come from economics, and as I said, I don't have a long background in defence and strategic issues. But I think all of those issues, economic policy, social policy, have benefited in the past from being integrated into the mainstream political debate. So it created an imperative for politicians to have to articulate their positions more clearly, and that had a knockback effect on the participants in it. Now that's morphed over the years, probably morphed earlier than it morphed in your area of expertise. The floating of the dollar created this whole new area of contestability, if you like. You had the financial markets all having poaching the Treasury officers. You had groups like Access Economics and others developing sort of shadow roles. So it created its own ginger group. Now, as an outsider to defence and foreign affairs issues, effectively, to me it seems like it's remained in its silo. And so people like just to give you an idea, there used to be 12 people in the Fin Review Bureau here. There's now 5 essentially, and so but I have to sort of wander into this, as I say, the scope for gullible journalists to just have to be led by the nose is fairly high. And if journos don't understand it and the general public aren't engaged in it, it's pretty hard to get that sort of gingerish area, which ultimately has a virtuous circle of politicians demanding more of the public service. That's one side of it. And there's a whole another 20,000 words in my very excellent essay, which you can read about this, about the problems that have led to exactly what you're talking about. But there'll just be a couple of observations I'd make.
Yeah. I mean, Tony, when you started your comments, I was getting a little worried you were going to ask for a refund or something. So I'm relieved in that sense. But look, I think there is a problem, and I think there's a couple of factors which are contributing to it. One is the closed nature of Canberra. So, unlike Washington, unlike London, Ottawa even for that matter, we don't have that easy interchange between government and the business community. We have an academic community that for the most part defines its role as being separate from all of this public policy stuff. And so it's too easy for the public service to look inward rather than outward. Secondly, we've had, I think very quick changes of government, very short terms for ministers, and that means to say that they're not demanding, as Laura talks about, the product that they need to have in front of them to think up new ideas. And finally, we promote on the basis of the ability to manage risk away rather than to engage with risk and come up with new thinking. I mean, no one gets promoted for thinking wild ideas in the public service. And I think that's a problem, which ultimately can only be solved if government tries to drag more policy advice out of the bureaucracy.
Let me take 2 or 3 quick ones, and then I think I may have to draw it to a close, looking at the programme order. Please.
Just developing Tony's question, if you've actually put your finger on with this document one issue that's a very good illustration of this whole process, and that's the idea of nuclear submarines. Now, back in the days, nearly a decade ago, when Australia was talking about replacing the colonies, the discussion in the sort of among the public sort of ranged from an evolved Collins right through to nuclear submarines. Now, that was the time for the government to commission a report like you've done and deal with the issue of can we have nuclear submarines, and it was never done. And what basically happened, and what would have happened, what will happen if the debate's not handled properly, is that you'll have a repeat of what happened when one political party suggested we need nuclear power in Australia, and the opposition went to town saying, with a campaign saying you'll have a sort of Chernobyl-style nuclear power station in every electorate. And that quite possibly cost them enough votes to cost them the election. Now, to what extent do you believe that political contest and the weakness of political debate and the lack of courage among politicians is actually causing a strategic problem? The sort of lack of innovation, the lack of boldness in coming up with ideas.
Thanks, Brendan. I will take another sir down the front.
Given that Australia is now geopolitically has more utility than in previous years in the United States-Australia alliance, what can we get out of the United States and what can we get out of Japan that is beneficial to Australia when we're taking on strategic risk in continuing a deep and strong alliance?
A nice narrow question. And then finally, down the front.
Seizing on Laura's phrase paradigm shift and Peter's reference to inconsistencies between authors, is there an inconsistency between the advocacy of a nuclear powered submarine and Kim Beazley's advocacy of unmanned underwater vehicles, enabled, I suppose, in part by more advanced batteries, which make possible long-range unmanned underwater vehicles, and also, for that matter, mean that the next generation of manned submarine will have fancy batteries rather than nuclear power.
Okay, maybe Laura, can you, this be like the insiders, a journalist answering another journalist, but that question that Brendan asked on the politics of a nuclear debate, maybe you could answer that one, and
Yeah.
Malcolm, I assume you'll answer the question that Doug has just raised, and then Peter can answer the alliance management big one, and then I will have to draw it to a close. But the good news is they're all stopping for sausage rolls, so you can interrogate them. So maybe Laura, could you just,
Yep.
Brendan Nicholson's point, which I think is a good one, are we sort of ready for this sort of debate?
Yeah. I'm getting foolishly optimistic in my old age, and I would observe that Labor at the moment is actually, people always talk about how important it is to get bipartisanship, but I actually think the really important thing is opposition's creating the space for a government to move. Now, there are plenty of examples of that where in the 1990s the coalition's moved to the right actually gave the Labor government of the days, or in the late 80s, the room to move into more free market territory than it otherwise would occupy. At the moment, I think one of the really interesting and exciting aspects of things is that Labor has moved in areas both defence and non-defence, which have allowed the coalition to move. One of them in the economic sphere obviously is negative gearing, and I think frankly the coalition is completely nuts not to seize that opportunity. But obviously the thing that's really, I think, transformed the nuclear debate in Australia is actually what Jay Weatherall's done in South Australia, and that I think has provided a chink which is, federal Labor's not talking about it much, but it has provided the room so that there wasn't complete, you wrote the story this morning, Brendan and I did, and my phone didn't go into meltdown, nuclear or otherwise, when people saying, oh, this is a terrible idea and outrageous and things like that. Now, maybe that's just because nobody read the Fin Review in the Australian today, but, I think that's one of the really interesting dynamics. And the interesting thing to me about it is that the reason why Labor's doing that is because they say to you, look, our experience of the last 10 years is that there is no point winning government without a mandate to do stuff. Now, we won't get into mandate theory, but that's their experience from looking at what they did and what Tony Abbott did, and there's no point winning if you can't do stuff. So they've learned a lesson out of that, and I think the coalition has also learnt that lesson, but I think it's more complicated for them because they're having to manoeuvre into a new administration where the Prime Minister's main constraining factor is pretending that he isn't the sort of grumpy old Malcolm of old to his own party. But I think there's actually quite a lot of political scope for for some change, with a generational change in politics.
Thank you. Malcolm, developments in underwater technology in
Doug,
about 30 seconds.
Doug, thanks for the question. I think unmanned underwater vehicles, or UUVs as they're called, are just going to be a tool in the toolbox for undersea warfare. The battery technology you're talking about, whether it's lithium, ion or air-independent propulsion, is going to be there, but it's never going to equal the potential in terms of performance and propulsion for nuclear power. And in fact, I would argue that unmanned underwater vehicles make it more important to get nuclear-powered submarines, because submarines will need to be more capable against that broader suite of threats, including unmanned underwater vehicles. So, the battery technology issue is an important thing, but the requirement and the justification for nuclear submarines is never going to go away, because nuclear submarines, frankly, are so much more capable than conventional submarines, or even submarines with lithium ion or air-independent propulsion. There's a clear capability and technical justification for them.
Last word to the Director.
Well, just on that point, Kim's point was not so much that submarines will be outmoded, but more are we keeping up with the Joneses in terms of that generation. I think by the time we get into the 2030s, we'll be thinking of submarines as sort of a mothership from which unmanned systems will operate, and that's a different concept to deal with. And then on to the alliance question. Again, if you go to the Defence White Paper, you'll see probably 20 or 30 references in the document which actually talk about things we need to get from the US in order to support more interoperability between the ADF and them. And the menu spans from integrating a combat aircraft, fifth generation combat aircraft, through to ballistic missile defence, space, cyber, special forces, undersea warfare. The list is enormous. In almost every case, if you asked yourself the question, could we do this without the US, the answer would be almost no at any price. We just wouldn't have the national resources that we could devote to it absent the US alliance. So it does remain critically important. In one sense, I think the advent of Trump has been quite useful because for the first time in a very long time, it's reminded us that, you know, America can make some decisions here that mightn't suit Australia's interests. And I think to get a little bit worried about that might help us to spend a bit more time actually thinking about the alliance rather than treating it at times with contempt. As far as the Japanese relationship is concerned, I mean, there's no doubt from a psychological point of view, the Japanese feel the hurt of not having won the submarine tendering process. And I think the ball's in our court very much now to actually go to them to say, well, here's a list of things that we'd like to work more closely with you on. And in fact, that US list that I quoted is pretty much the list that we have in terms of common interests with the Japanese as well. There's enormous potential, I think, in terms of what we can do with Japan. But I would say sometime in the next 6 months or so, and again, an early priority for the government after the second, really should be to get up to Tokyo and say, now sorry about that thing that just happened, but let's now start talking about what are the things that we could do.
Thanks, Peter. You know, two of the core reasons why this institute was established were to inject contestable public policy advice around strategic issues, and secondly, of course, to inform public discussion on these matters. And I think, you know, this document, I think, makes a contribution to both those core missions of this institute. As Malcolm, and well done Malcolm Davis for coordinating and pulling this together. I think as Peter said, there was over 25 contributors to this volume. It was a team effort, and but certainly led very much by Malcolm Davis. I commend this to you. I think one of the other underlying points that I would make is that we are a bipartisan institute, and the policy recommendations that fall out of the various chapters are genuinely have been produced with a real commitment to bipartisanship. It makes light relief from tax reform, even though I read Laura's pieces on that all the time. I commend it to you. Please join with me in thanking our panel tonight, particularly Laura Tingle. Thank you.